How fast can one shot change everything? A single bullet dropped a 10-foot grizzly in the Yukon. A perfect elk hunt ended under 6 feet of avalanche snow. One hunter nearly drowned after a river ambush by a charging bear. In the freezing Siberian forest, a man survived 7 days with no food, no fire, and no help. A wild boar in a quiet vineyard turned a simple hunt into a full-speed charge. And deep in Montana, a bear tore through a tent in the middle of the night. Watch the video to see how these wild moments became stories of survival, instinct, and shock. It was October 16, 2018, when 3 men made their way into the cold backcountry of Yukon, Canada. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and frost, and light snow covered the trails. Among them was Nathan Briggs, a seasoned hunter from Alberta, known for his steady aim and deep respect for the wilderness. He was 41 years old, had been hunting since his teens, and carried a strong reputation across local hunting circles. Alongside him was Kyle Mason, 36, who worked in forestry and had recently developed an interest in large game hunting. The third man, Martin Shaw, was a professional guide with over 30 years of experience tracking grizzlies and moose in the Yukon's wild terrain. The 3 had planned this hunt for months. They had studied maps, weather patterns, and animal movement reports. The goal was clear: to track a mature grizzly bear before hibernation season started. October was known as one of the last opportunities to do so safely. By this time, bears fed heavily and moved closer to lower ground where food was easier to find. They began their journey at sunrise, hiking along a narrow creek that ran through a wide valley lined with spruce and fir trees. Large paw prints appeared in the damp mud, and the signs were fresh. Twigs had been snapped, and the smell of raw meat drifted faintly through the cold air. Martin knew what that meant. The bear had found a kill site, and it was likely still nearby. They moved slowly and carefully, stopping often to scan the dense forest with binoculars. The sounds of crows overhead and the rustle of shifting branches kept them on edge. After 2 hours, they spotted the carcass of a moose near the edge of a bend in the creek. Blood stained the snow. Standing beside it was a huge grizzly bear. Its fur was thick and dark, and it stood nearly 10 feet tall as it rose to sniff the air. The bear had not yet seen them. Nathan dropped to one knee behind a fallen spruce tree, raising his rifle. He had practiced for this moment many times before. The bear turned sideways, sensing their presence. It looked directly toward them and paused. Nathan took a breath, steadied the barrel, and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the valley. The bullet struck high in the shoulder, angling into the bear's lungs. The animal dropped instantly, collapsing in place without taking another step. Snow flew up around its body as it hit the ground. The forest fell quiet. None of the men moved for several moments. Even Martin, who had seen many bear hunts in his lifetime, stood still. The weight of what had happened hung in the air like mist. This was not a celebration, it was respect. They had tracked and taken down a massive predator with precision and care. But the moment was not over yet. Nathan slowly lowered his rifle. His breath came out in short, visible clouds. Kyle stepped forward, careful not to disturb the snow. Martin led the way, keeping his eyes fixed on the massive bear lying ahead. The bear's size was overwhelming. Its body filled the space beside the creek like a fallen tree. Its fur was thick with moisture and stained from the moose it had been feeding on. There was no movement, no final gasp. The shot had done its job quickly and cleanly. The 3 men stood in silence. They had followed every step with focus and respect. And now they faced the result. Martin examined the bear closely. It was indeed one of the largest he had ever seen in his career. The muscles, the paws, the jaws, everything spoke of power and survival. This was a wild animal that had lived through many harsh winters. It had likely fought for territory, food, and life itself. They took photos for documentation and measurement. The bear's length and weight would be recorded later for the regional wildlife registry. Martin made sure everything was done properly. There were rules in this land, and they followed them. They began to field dress the animal, preserving its hide and other parts for legal use and study. Nothing was wasted, and every step was done with purpose. As they worked, the temperature dropped. A strong wind came down from the northern ridge. Snow started to fall in light flakes. The trail back to camp would be harder with the added weight, but they were prepared. They wrapped the important parts of the bear in canvas and secured them to their packs. It would take more than one trip to bring everything back. The hike back was slow and quiet. Each man carried the moment with him. Nathan thought about the years he had spent training, reading, and learning. He understood now more than ever what patience and timing meant. Kyle, though newer to this life, gained a deep respect for the wild and for the animals that called it home. Martin, with his decades of experience, felt pride not in the kill but in how the hunt had been handled. There had been no rush, no carelessness, only calm action. They reached their camp just before sunset. Smoke from the fire curled into the sky. They warmed their hands and sat together, sharing the quiet peace that came after a long, intense day. They did not speak much. Words were not needed. Later, when they returned to the nearest town, they checked in with the local wildlife office. The data they collected would help with tracking bear populations. Hunters and researchers alike would learn from what they had recorded. It was more than a trophy. It was a moment in nature, one that was remembered and respected. That one shot, taken at the right time with care and skill, would stay with them forever. It was not just a hunt. It was a lesson in balance, respect, and the raw truth of the wilderness. On October 26, 2020, the morning air above the San Juan Mountains in Colorado felt thin and sharp. Two elk hunters, Brandon and Marcus, had been hiking since before daylight, moving across rough terrain that was dusted in early snow. Both were lifelong outdoorsmen raised in the plains of eastern Colorado, but the high country always held a different kind of challenge. Brandon, 36, worked as a fire equipment mechanic and was known for his quiet focus in the field. Marcus, his close friend since high school, was 34 and worked in forestry. Together, they had hunted this region several times, always respecting the power of the mountains. They were well prepared, each carrying a pack filled with cold weather gear, rangefinders, maps, and food. Their rifles were sighted in for long distances, something that had proven necessary in these steep valleys and ridgelines. They had glassed for days, tracking fresh signs, noting rubs and trails, and setting up in likely spots before first light. It was the final afternoon of their trip when they finally got the break they were hoping for. From a narrow ridge above a frozen draw, they spotted a lone bull elk bedded near a shale slope. The animal was big, mature, and sitting calmly under the shadow of a narrow rock wall. Brandon steadied his rifle and measured the distance. It read 280 yards. The wind was calm. He exhaled slowly and took the shot. The bullet struck true, a clean hit behind the front leg. The elk stood abruptly, staggered, then took off downslope, its heavy steps scattering chunks of snow and rock. Brandon and Marcus watched closely, hoping it would collapse within view. But before they could move to track it, the sound of low thunder rolled across the basin. From the high ridge above the opposite slope, a deep white wave began to fall. A slab of packed snow broke free, building speed and size as it tore downward. Trees bent, and loose debris was pulled into the fast-moving sheet. The hunters could only watch from a distance as the elk's path crossed directly into the avalanche's line. Within seconds, a massive white cloud swallowed the draw. The rush of snow finally slowed and then stopped. The valley was silent again, but everything had changed. Where there was once scattered rock and forest, there now sat a smooth, broken surface covered in deep snow. Brandon and Marcus looked at each other, stunned. The elk was gone. Their packs still sat behind them, untouched. They had no choice but to climb down carefully, step by step, watching for more movement above. They knew how dangerous this moment was, and how quickly conditions could shift again. The ridge that had promised success now held silence and cold. The elk had been hit well, but nature had taken over in a way they could never have planned for. With cautious steps, they began the slow descent into the aftermath. The snow was deep and uneven, with small cracks forming across the top layer. Brandon and Marcus stepped slowly, using poles to check the stability of the surface. The quiet was strange and heavy, broken only by their boots pressing down through soft powder. They reached the edge of the slide path and paused, scanning the area where the elk had last been seen. The landscape was unrecognizable. What had once been a slope dotted with brush and stone was now a flat sheet of snow stretching nearly 100 yards wide. They spread out carefully, looking for signs. After nearly an hour of searching, Marcus spotted something dark just below a small tree leaning sideways. It was blood, frozen to a rock. A few feet away, a broken branch stuck out from the snow at an odd angle. It had snapped during the rush, bent and twisted under the weight of the moving snow. But aside from that, there was nothing. No elk, no visible body, no gear knocked loose. It was all buried under at least 6 feet of snow. They stood there in silence. They knew the elk was gone. Trying to dig it out would be dangerous, and there was no clear way to know exactly where it lay. The shot had been good. They had done everything right. But the mountain had made its own choice. In places like this, success was never guaranteed. Brandon adjusted his pack, still full. Marcus kicked at the snow, frustrated but quiet. They began the long hike out in silence. The air had turned colder and light snow began to fall. Every few minutes they looked back toward the ridge, not to spot the elk, but to remember where the moment had turned. Hours passed before they reached the trailhead again. Their truck sat parked near the tree line, covered in frost. They packed up their gear slowly, shoulders tired, not just from the hike, but from the weight of what had happened. When they returned to town, they told only a few close friends about the trip. There was no trophy to show, no photos, no celebration, only a lesson. The story they shared was not about success, but about the thin line between control and chaos in the high country. They had made a perfect shot, but nature had taken the end result away. The next season, they returned to the same range, not for the same elk, but to honor the land that had reminded them who was really in charge. They planned better routes, watched weather signs more closely, and never assumed the end of the story would go their way. What they learned was simple. The wild does not follow plans. Even the cleanest hunt can end in silence. They kept hunting, kept climbing, but always remembered that mountain, a place where skill met snow and disappeared under a white sheet, leaving only memory behind. On July 28, 2021, the banks of a fast-moving river deep in the Alaskan wilderness roared with the sound of salmon rushing upstream. The season had drawn in large predators from every corner of the forest, and it was the peak time for spotting grizzlies. That morning, 3 experienced hunters moved slowly through the damp underbrush, their rifles at the ready. These men were not tourists or beginners. They had grown up in rural parts of the state and had learned to read tracks, study behavior, and move through wild terrain without stirring the air too much. Leading the group was Jason Cole, a skilled tracker who had worked with wildlife guides before switching to seasonal hunting. Just behind him walked Travis Dean, known in their group for his steady aim and calm judgment. The third man, Eli Harper, had a background in search and rescue. He often stayed slightly behind, watching angles and spotting potential danger from above. The 3 men had hunted together for years, building a strong understanding of each other's movements. That day, they followed a stretch of river known for salmon runs and wide-open views. Deep prints in the mud showed fresh grizzly activity, and torn branches along the willow trees confirmed the animal had passed recently. Jason signaled quietly and kept walking, his .30.06 bolt-action rifle resting against his shoulder. The sound of rushing water made it hard to hear anything else, and mist from the river filled the air. They stepped carefully along the gravel and paused where tracks circled back toward the water. Suddenly, a 600-pound grizzly burst out from thick willows, charging head-on. The noise was drowned under the river's roar, giving no warning. The bear's muscles rippled as it lunged straight toward Jason. Caught off guard, he raised his rifle too quickly and the shot went wide. The bullet tore through the air above the bear's head. In one motion, the bear reached him, swiping his arm and knocking him into the river. Jason disappeared into the current, his body dragged away by the freezing water. Travis dropped to one knee on the gravel bar, aimed fast, and fired twice. One round struck the bear's shoulder, slowing it but not stopping it. The bear turned slightly, growling with rage. From higher up the slope, Eli waited until the bear gave a broadside view, then fired once. The bullet struck through the chest, straight into the lungs. The bear let out a final growl and collapsed just a few feet from where Travis had fired. The silence that followed was sharp. Steam rose from the bear's fur. Eli and Travis looked around quickly, realizing Jason had been swept downriver. They ran along the edge, calling his name, trying to spot movement in the cold, fast current. The trail of disturbed water and a torn wool glove floating downstream were the only clues they had. With daylight fading fast and cold setting in, the real test of survival had just begun. Travis pushed forward along the riverbank, eyes scanning the cold surface. The water was rough and loud, with sharp rocks jutting out in places. Eli stayed higher up, watching from a ridge in case Jason surfaced anywhere downstream. Time felt slower, and the cold air was sinking fast. A red smear on a wet stone caught Travis's eye. He slid down to the edge and looked ahead. A shape was barely visible in the shallows, tangled between two logs caught in the flow. They reached the spot and found Jason half submerged. His face was pale, lips turning blue, and his right arm was badly cut. His jacket was soaked through, and he was barely moving. Eli checked for breath. It was faint but steady. They pulled him from the water and dragged him to higher ground away from the edge. Travis opened his dry pack and took out wool layers and fuel tabs. Eli gathered birch bark and dry twigs from under an overhang. They got a fire going just as the sky turned gray. The heat from the flames helped bring back a little color to Jason's face. They wrapped him tightly in spare clothes and sat close to block the wind. His eyes opened once during the night, but he could not speak. His skin was cold to the touch and his hand trembled slightly. They knew he had lost blood and was slipping into shock. The bear's claw had left a deep gash across his arm and shoulder. The river had added hypothermia to his injuries. At first light, Eli left to climb toward a ridgeline where he could get a signal. After 2 hours, he reached a spot high enough for a weak connection. He called the nearest ranger outpost and gave coordinates. A rescue helicopter was sent right away, but flying conditions slowed everything. It took another 4 hours before they heard the faint chop of blades. Travis waved a piece of orange tarp, guiding them to the clearing. The rescue crew checked Jason's pulse and wrapped him in insulated blankets. He was lifted onto a stretcher and flown to a hospital in Anchorage. Doctors said later that the quick fire and warm layers had likely saved his life. He had deep wounds but would recover after weeks of treatment and rest. Back at the river, Eli and Travis packed up the camp. The bear's body remained where it fell, a reminder of how fast the wild could turn. They buried the spent shells and cleared away the fire ring. It felt quiet again, but the weight of what happened stayed with them. Jason recovered over the next month. His arm healed with time, though the scars remained. All three men later said that no amount of skill could ever make the wild safe. The river, the bear, the cold, each had tested them. They had survived, but they returned home changed. It was October 9, 2018, when 33-year-old Andrei Makarov joined a group of 4 experienced hunters for a week-long trip deep into the Siberian taiga. Andrei lived in Krasnoyarsk, a large city surrounded by rivers and forests. He worked as a mechanic but spent his free time exploring the wild. Ever since he was a teenager, he had loved camping, fishing, and reading old books about survival. His father had taught him basic hunting skills, and he often practiced building fires and shelters in his backyard. This trip was meant to be a break from work, a time to enjoy nature with friends and test his outdoor skills in a real setting. The group took a long train ride north and then traveled by truck through muddy forest roads. They reached a remote section of the taiga filled with thick pine trees, clear streams, and patches of low-growing berries. It was a beautiful but unforgiving place. The plan was simple: spend 5 days tracking deer and small game, then return to their base camp. On the third morning, a heavy fog rolled through the forest. Visibility dropped quickly and everything became quiet and still. Andrei had gone out to follow some fresh tracks. Within an hour, he realized he could no longer see the flags tied to trees or hear his group's calls. He tried retracing his steps, but the fog made everything look the same. He was alone, without a radio or food, carrying only a small knife, a lighter shell with no fuel, and some paracord in his coat pocket. Andrei stayed calm. He knew panicking would only waste energy. He walked toward a stream he had passed earlier, hoping it would help him find his way back. But as hours passed and the sky darkened, he understood that he would have to spend the night alone. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset. With only a few hours of daylight left, he cut pine branches to make a lean-to against a tree trunk. He covered it with more branches and moss to block the wind. He used the flint wheel from his empty lighter to spark dry bark and started a small fire. That night, he barely slept. The cold bit through his clothes, and every sound made him sit up in fear. By morning, he was hungry and weak. He searched near berry bushes and found some lingonberries. He also saw signs of birds moving through the branches. Using his shoelaces and bits of paracord, he built small snares and tied them near low limbs. He walked slowly along the stream, looking for fish. He sharpened a stick with his knife and turned it into a simple spear. He caught a small trout by late afternoon and roasted it on hot stones. The warmth and food gave him hope, but the forest around him felt endless. He didn't know how long he would be lost. His survival would now depend on his patience, knowledge, and the forest itself. By the fourth day, Andre's body felt weaker. His arms were tired from gathering wood and his legs ached from walking across uneven ground. But his focus stayed sharp. He checked his snares and found one bird caught in the thin cord. He cleaned it carefully and saved half of the meat for the next day. He also dug for roots near the stream and found a few that he remembered were safe to eat from his training. Each small success gave him strength. Andre kept moving during daylight, searching for better shelter or signs of help. He stayed close to the river, knowing it might lead toward more open ground. His firewood was getting low, so he dragged fallen branches back to his camp whenever he could. At night, he stayed curled under his moss-covered lean-to, with embers glowing near his feet to keep the cold away. On the sixth day, the sky cleared slightly. He climbed a small hill near the stream and spotted a wider bend in the river below. He decided to build a large fire near that area. Using dry grass, bark, and what remained of his paracord as a wick, he made a smoky blaze that rose between the trees. He stayed near the fire, hoping someone might see the signal. He had no way to measure time anymore, but each hour felt endless. The next morning, his fire was low again. He gathered more bark and branches, feeding the flames with slow movements. His hands shook from cold and weakness. Suddenly, he heard the low sound of an engine. At first, he thought it was wind, but then he saw a small helicopter moving over the river, circling wide. He jumped up and waved his arms. The smoke must have worked. The helicopter came closer, then circled once more before lowering near a clear patch beside the water. Two rescuers ran toward him. One wrapped a blanket around his shoulders while the other gave him warm tea from a metal bottle. They guided him into the aircraft. Inside, heat flowed through his frozen fingers and toes. He did not speak much, but his eyes stayed open. His breathing slowed, and he began to relax for the first time in a week. Back in Krasnoyarsk, doctors treated him for dehydration and exhaustion. He had lost weight, but there were no serious injuries. News of his survival spread through the community. Many called it a story of courage and strength, but Andre only said he was lucky and grateful for what he had learned. He returned to work a few weeks later, quieter than before, but with a deeper respect for the wild. The taiga had tested him beyond limits, but he endured. He kept the paracord and flint wheel in a box at home as reminders. Nature had nearly taken everything from him, but in the end, it had taught him how to survive with almost nothing at all. On October 23, 2020, morning mist hung low over the vineyards near Montpellier, a city in southern France known for its hills and long rows of grapevines. The air was cool, and soft earth clung to boots as hunters moved into position for a traditional battue. Among them was Julien Martel, a 42-year-old man who had been hunting wild boars since he was a teenager. He had grown up just outside Montpellier, learning to shoot and track with his father during weekend hunts in the countryside. Julien worked in a local garage, fixing tractors and small trucks, but every autumn, he cleared his weekends for the hunt. He loved the quiet of the vineyards at dawn and the energy of the hunt as beaters pushed animals forward through the brush. This battue was organized by the local hunting club and included trained dogs and experienced hunters who knew the land well. Julien stood in a narrow row between the grapevines. His back straight, his shotgun loaded with buckshot. He wore a green jacket, gloves, and sturdy boots that had been through many seasons. The dogs barked in the distance, and the voices of beaters echoed through the leaves. He listened carefully, watching the vines ahead for any movement. Suddenly, everything went quiet. The barking stopped, and the only sound was the wind passing through the dry grape leaves. Then, without warning, a dark shape burst from the thick brush. A massive wild boar came crashing into view, covered in mud, its thick fur bristling. It ran straight toward Julien with shocking speed, its tusks sharp and wide. He raised his shotgun and fired quickly, but the shot was low, striking the ground in front of the animal. The boar didn't stop. Its hooves kicked up loose soil as it charged through the vines. Julien tried to step back, but slipped and fell hard onto his back. The boar was on him in seconds, slamming into his leg. Pain shot up his shin as the sharp tusks tore through his boot and hit his lower leg. Julien rolled to the side, heart racing, hands shaking. He lifted the shotgun again from where it had landed next to him. The boar was turning to charge again. He fired once into its shoulder, then again into the center of its chest. The shots hit deep and the huge animal stumbled, then dropped to the ground. It gave a loud breath and lay still. Julian stayed on the ground for a few moments, breathing hard, his hands muddy and his jacket torn. His leg throbbed, but he knew he was lucky to be alive. The boar, now silent, had come close to taking him down. He sat up slowly, looking at the thick scars on the animal's body. This was no young boar. It had fought other hunters before and survived. And now Julian had survived it too. Julian stayed seated on the vineyard floor for several minutes, feeling the pain in his leg grow stronger. His breathing slowed, and he started to notice more details around him. The grapevines were bent from the boar's charge, and broken leaves lay scattered across the soil. The early light filtered through the vines, casting long shadows over the scene. The animal's large body remained still, its dark fur dusted with dirt and crushed stems. He carefully pulled himself to his feet, leaning against a thick vine post for support. His boot was torn open, and blood soaked into the cloth around his ankle. Though it hurt badly, the wound was not deep enough to stop him from walking. He began limping slowly toward the rest of the hunting group who had heard the shots and were now moving in his direction. When they reached Julian, they looked down at the large boar and saw the torn earth where the fight had taken place. One man examined the animal and saw several scars across its chest and side. The group agreed it must have been a dominant male, toughened by years of surviving in rough terrain. Its size was larger than usual, and its tusks had chipped edges, likely from fighting other animals for space and food. Julian was helped to a nearby clearing where another hunter opened a first aid kit. They wrapped his leg tightly and helped him sit in the shade. While he rested, the others cleared the area, moving carefully through the grape rows to make sure no more animals were nearby. Everyone remained quiet, respectful of the moment and what had nearly gone wrong. Later in the afternoon, a small pickup truck drove into the vineyard to carry Julian back to the village. He leaned against the seat, his leg bandaged, his hands still shaking slightly. The ride was slow, passing through narrow dirt paths between hills and old trees. Each bump in the road made him wince, but he stayed calm, thinking about what had just happened. News of the event spread through the village. People talked about the size of the boar and how close the attack had come. Some hunters said they had seen signs of large animals feeding in the vineyards, but never expected one to charge during a battue. Others reminded everyone to stay careful, as wild animals could be bold when food was easy to find. Julian rested for a week, keeping his leg elevated and bandages clean. He thought a lot about the boar and the hunt. He knew it was not only about skill, but also timing, luck, and staying calm. He had survived because he had kept his focus, even when the animal was just steps away. When his leg healed, he returned to the vineyard, walking slowly along the same path. The rows of grapes looked peaceful again, but for Julian, the memory of that day would always stay with him. It was October 17, 2018, when two lifelong hunting partners, Mason Hale and Connor Brooks, pitched their tent near a cold mountain creek deep within Montana's Bitterroot Range. Both men were in their early 40s, raised in small mountain towns where hunting season was a serious tradition. Mason, a quiet and steady tracker, worked as a lumbermill technician in Hamilton. Connor, who had served in the military before becoming a backcountry guide, was known for his quick thinking and deep respect for the wild. They had spent the day hiking across steep terrain in search of elk, moving through thick pine groves and open hillsides. Hours of patience and quiet watching had paid off just before sunset, when Mason spotted a large bull elk moving through a clearing. With one clean shot, they brought it down. They quickly dressed the animal and hung most of the meat high in a tree far from camp, as they had done many times before. But the pair, tired and cold, had kept some jerky and scraps inside the tent, planning to eat more after sunrise. Their camp sat in a low basin near the water, with their tent tucked beneath a cluster of fir trees. The sound of rushing water filled the air, masking small noises from the forest. A soft wind blew through the branches, and the stars above were sharp and bright. Both men fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the long day. In the early hours, around 2 a.m., the silence broke. Mason opened his eyes to a low, rough growl just inches from his head. The thin fabric of the tent moved, and then came the sound of tearing. A dark shape pushed through the flap, massive and strong. A black bear, lured by the scent of meat, had clawed into the tent without hesitation. Mason barely had time to move before the bear grabbed his pack and yanked hard, pulling him partway outside. Pain surged through his shoulder as the animal's jaws clamped down. Connor, half asleep at first, was jolted awake by the noise and movement. He reached for the rifle beside his sleeping bag, but the bear had already turned and swiped at him, knocking his arm hard and sending the gun sliding into the shadows. The inside of the tent was chaos, dimly lit and filled with the sound of growling, breathing, and shifting gear. Mason struggled beneath the weight of the bear, using a hunting knife to strike back again and again. As the bear twisted toward him again, Connor pushed through the pain and crawled toward the weapon. His hand found it in the dark, and he pulled the stock into his shoulder. He fired once, the shot loud in the cold air. The bear lurched, and the second shot came a moment later. The wounded animal let out a deep noise, then turned and crashed into the woods, vanishing into the trees. The tent was torn, their gear scattered, blood stained the ground, and both men were hurt, but alive. The forest around the camp was quiet again, but the damage left behind was impossible to ignore. Mason lay on the ground with a deep wound in his shoulder, his clothes torn and damp. Connor moved quickly, checking the bleeding and helping his friend sit up against a tree. Both men were shaking, their bodies sore and cold, but they were still breathing. Mason's side hurt with every movement, and Connor's arm throbbed from the strike. The air smelled like smoke from the gunfire and the sharp scent of pine. They stayed alert for a long time, watching the tree line in case the bear returned. It did not. Slowly, they cleaned up the site. The gear was scattered all over, and the tent was full of holes. Blood marked the grass, and parts of the meat bag had been dragged a short distance away. The bear had taken what it could before running off into the woods. As the sky turned pale with morning light, Connor started a fire with dry twigs and flint. The warmth helped settle their nerves. They used bandages from the first aid kit to wrap the wounds. Mason's shoulder was swollen and red, and deep scratches marked both his arms. Connor's bruised arm made it hard to lift things, but he worked carefully, making sure Mason stayed awake and stable. By sunrise, they packed what supplies they could still carry and began walking slowly down the trail. The forest felt different now. Every broken branch made them stop and listen. The path they had once walked with ease now felt long and heavy. Hours passed as they moved down the mountain, helping each other over fallen logs and narrow ridges. Neither spoke. Their bodies ached, and every step reminded them of the danger they had survived. When they finally reached the road, they used a satellite phone to call for help. Rangers arrived later that afternoon and treated the injuries. They said bear sightings had increased that season. Many had wandered closer to the camps looking for food. The rangers asked about the meat and where it was stored. Connor admitted some had been kept inside the tent. The rangers nodded and reminded them of the importance of storing everything away from sleeping areas. Mason was taken to a hospital in Missoula where doctors cleaned and stitched the wounds. He stayed there for a few days before being released. The pain took weeks to fade. His movements stayed stiff for a while, but he healed. Connor's arm also recovered after a few days of rest. They returned to their homes with scars and a new understanding of how fast things could change in the wild. They had been careful in the past, but this experience showed them that even small mistakes could lead to danger. The lesson stayed with them. They kept going into the backcountry, but never again with food inside their shelter. Every trip after that one was planned with double the caution. That night in the Bitterroots became a turning point. For Mason and Connor, it was not just a close call. It was a reminder that even strong and skilled hunters are still guests in bear country.